Now, 11 years ago, Paul Blomfield, who is the Labour MP for Sheffield Central, was in Parliament when he got a phone call. And he was told in that call that his father had died. Now, his dad was 87, he had terminal lung cancer, but he'd taken his own life. And since then, Paul's been campaigning for a change in the law to allow assisted dying. Helping someone to take their own life is currently illegal and punishable with up to 14 years in jail. That's under the Suicide Act of 1961. Now, new polling by Dignity in Dying, which campaigns for a change in the law, does show there is support for Parliament to debate the issue. Before we hear from Paul, there is a warning that his interview discusses suicide. Some viewers may find it upsetting. I certainly did when I spoke to him. What is the current law when it comes to assisted dying?
Well, essentially it's illegal. The current law prevents people having choice at the end of their life, and it drives people to take very desperate measures in many cases, like my father did. And
also those around them, if it's seen that anyone's assisted someone in taking their own life.
Yes, even discussing their plans would make family members complicit, and of course some people have been prosecuted for that.
And what do you want to happen?
I want to see a change in the law which gives people choice, which means that for people who have a terminal diagnosis of 6 months or less and know the end is certain, that they can choose the point at which they pass instead of, in many cases, having to live out a fairly miserable death.
Now, you mentioned your father, and of course earlier you gave a very moving speech in the House of Commons about him and about how he chose to take his own life. I think it was exactly 8 years after you received the phone call in Westminster to say that he had died that you gave this speech. He was 87. What was your father called?
Harry.
Harry. He sounds like a really extraordinary person from what you were saying. You know, you talked about him having quite a tough upbringing in the East End of London.
Yeah, he was brought up in poverty. The war changed it for him because he became an RAF pilot, and that opened up opportunities. I mean, he was offered a job as an airline pilot, but he turned it down because he thought there was no future in commercial aviation.
I love that.
But he built a very successful business career, and he had a good life and he enjoyed it.
Yeah, you said, I think in the speech, that he was someone who made the most of his life.
Absolutely.
What kind of person was he?
Well, he was a great father. He was a very private person, but even so, I think he would want me to talk about his death because I know he always believed in giving people choice. And in a sense, that should have given me an indication of what he might do after he had a terminal diagnosis, but I didn't really factor it in.
What kind of things did he say to you then?
Well, he was quite positive, even after his diagnosis, and was trying to make the most of things. And so it was a real shock to get a call out of the blue to say he'd been found dead in his garage.
You said that he had a terminal diagnosis. It was inoperable lung cancer.
He was, yeah.
Was that out of the blue, or was it something that was expected?
He'd only talked to me about the diagnosis a couple of months earlier. He'd spent a short spell in hospital, and I don't know how long, because he was such a private person, I don't know how long he'd actually been suffering. He'd had kind of respiratory issues, but there was a time at which he was a heavy smoker. So the actual diagnosis, I think, was a shock for him, and it was for us.
And you say, you know, he's someone who sees life by the sound of it as well, so someone who wanted to make...
He'd had his share of health problems. He'd been diabetic for many years. He just coped with them all.
And you were in Westminster when you found out news of his death. It was a phone call, was it?
Yeah.
What were you doing at the time, do you remember?
I think I was walking between meetings.
Yeah.
And it was a phone call from his partner.
I mean, it must have been very difficult to hear.
It was really hard. So, obviously I got on a train and straight back to Sheffield.
And you said that you had spoken to him the night before as well.
Yeah, as it happened, I'd been down, it was on the Sunday evening and was walking in St James's Park. And we had a perfectly ordinary conversation.
It's such a difficult... I just want to say thank you for talking to us about it. I completely recognise how difficult it is. So if there's any point you want to take a breather or take a glass of water, and just do that, OK? You said at the beginning of the interview that because of the laws around assisted dying, people can't talk about anything with their loved ones, whether it's yourself or whether it's people's partners. You know, is that something that you feel strongly about, I guess, after what happened with your father?
Well, really strongly, and it's a point I made in more than one debate in the Commons, that a lot of the discussion around assisted dying is focused on what would the terrain look like if we changed the law. And I think we need to give much more attention to what the law already does to people and the misery that it causes. So not changing the law is an act of deep harm for many people.
And if, obviously I know you want to speak for yourself, but so it's completely fine if you don't want to answer this question, but did his partner know about it either, I guess?
No.
And that must have been difficult for them as well.
Yeah, I mean, the point that I made is that you know, if the law had been different, as it is in other countries, as it's soon going to be in Scotland, probably, judging by the mood there, he could have talked to us. We'd have planned together. He would probably have lived longer. I think he took the decision to go prematurely because he wanted to act while he still could. And if he'd been able to talk, we could plan together, he'd have lived longer. And been able to die with his family around him.
Thank you. Sorry. No, not at all. Thank you for sharing your story, it's so important.
Sorry.
Take a moment.
Bear with me a second.
No, not at all. Just honestly, take as long as you can. It's incredibly powerful, and it is, I think the point that you make about how there is a situation that we need to look at the situation now is really important. Like, you know, you talk a lot about the risks and the downfalls of if you change the law, but as you say, like, not acting is also a decision. You say that they're already looking at changing the law in Scotland.
Yeah.
What kind of thing is happening there, and would you like the same thing to be happening in England as well?
Well, I mean, Scotland is following New Zealand, states in the US and others who've recognised that giving people choice is a humane and sensible thing to do. And Scotland's moving down that road, and it's along the lines that we would be seeking in England, to say that once people had had that terminal diagnosis, so that their end was inevitable, it was just a question of how and when they should be given that choice. And, you know, sometimes people will say, well, all we need is decent palliative care. Ironically, I mean, it was, and that's absolutely right, we should improve palliative care. But my father took his decision shortly after, ironically enough, he'd met the Macmillan nurse, and she talked about what the end might look like. And at 87, he'd seen a lot of his friends die, and some of them died quite badly. You know, there is this myth about palliative care that people involved in it do a fantastic job, but it doesn't mean going in gently into the sunset in the way that it's sometimes portrayed. With the very best palliative care, many people have very bad deaths. And I think, as my father thought, they should have a choice over whether they wanted that or they could go at their own time, of their own choosing.
That's one of the arguments, the palliative care argument. Another argument, I guess, is that people worry that if assisted dying becomes legal, then some people could be taken advantage of, that it's a slippery slope, that people who perhaps worry that they might be a burden to their loved ones could be encouraged to do something that they may not really want to do.
I think those who oppose assisted dying struggle to find reasons, and that's clearly one of the reasons that's put forward. I find it, in my circumstances, my experience, I find it quite offensive because I think most people want their loved ones to live longer.
Yeah, of course they do. Yeah.
My father would have lived longer if he'd had choice. The pressure that he felt was to take his life while he could.
While he still had the choice.
While he still had the capacity, because he'd seen friends die badly without that opportunity to act when they realised they wanted to. So I think the argument is actually, you can turn the argument on its head. Changing the law will let people live longer. And I don't see families using a change in the law to press people to go sooner.
Do you have any sense about what the attitude is in Westminster towards assisted dying or potential change in the law?
Well, Westminster's behind the curve. I think things are changing. Over the 12 years I've been in Parliament, I think the balance is shifting. There is more support, but we are still well behind the general public. The latest polling that I've seen has something like 81% of people supporting a change in the law to enable assisted dying. And that's almost identical between supporters of the two main parties. So Parliament needs to go quite some way to catch up with public opinion. Personally, I think it's only a question of time. But the issue is, how many people are going to suffer needlessly until Parliament gets its act together and changes the law in line with public opinion?
Just finally, at the beginning you were talking about people who only have a certain amount of time left to live. Do you think that is an important, control on it?
Yes, I think that this is a difficult area of law, but frankly, that's what Parliament's for. We do difficult law. But I think that it's a kind of sensible and balanced approach to, say, 6 months to live with a terminal diagnosis and that's kind of confirmed by doctors is a secure way of dealing with the issue. And that's what most people support.
So what would your message be to the Health Secretary then?
Well, I hope that the new Health Secretary will look afresh at the issue. Previous debate has kind of got us to a point where it looked as if the government were going to open up discussion and then it's pulled back. I think that we just need an open debate which gathers evidence, looks at people's experience and enables us to find time in Parliament to look at the issue properly, which we've never done.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.